Check, check. All right. Good morning, everyone. Oh, you could do better than that. Good morning. Welcome to Myers Park Baptist Church. For those of you who are coming from worship, we welcome you here into Heaton Hall. For those of you who missed worship and are here for this part of the program, we welcome you here to Myers Park Baptist Church. We're glad that you're here with us for the second part of our time with Dr. Toddie Peters as we celebrate Women's History Month here at Myers Park Baptist Church. I want to take a special moment before we go any further to acknowledge someone who helped me organize this event. I've known Dr. Toddie Peters for, it's 15 years maybe now, 12 years at this point, who led a women's retreat at my previous church. And so there's no one better to talk about this subject than her, but it's really Betty Guns, who is a friend of our church, whose daughter Mary Conlin is a member of our congregation, who is very passionate and an activist on reproductive justice here in the city of Charlotte, who really helped me organize this event and the event coming up on Friday. So Betty, thank you. Let's give Betty a round of applause and thank her for this help. Yes, thank you, Betty. We are excited to continue our Women's History Celebration and International Women's Day celebration by welcoming Reverend Dr. Toddie Peters, who is leading us today in this Faith Forum event. Dr. Peters is Professor of Religious Studies at Elon University. Her latest book, Trust Women, A Progressive Christian Argument for Reproductive Justice, was published by Beacon Press in 2018, and she is the principal investigator for the Abortion and Religion Project, which is, as she mentioned in her sermon, interviewing 500 Jewish, Christian, and Muslim women having abortions across the country. Dr. Peters is an ordained Presbyterian minister. We don't even have to say PCUSA here because we only acknowledge one kind of Presbyterian at Myers Park Baptist Church. And active denominationally and ecumenically, she chaired the Presbyterian Church's Task Force on Just Globalization and represents the PCUSA as a member of the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches and was recently elected Vice President of the Society of Christian Ethics. Please join me in giving another warm welcome to Reverend Dr. Toddie Peters.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you for this forum. I'm going to talk for a bit, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions and dialogue together. So, most of us, when we think about abortion and Christianity in the country, have a very negative perception. This is the dominant reality, and that's what I want to talk about with us today, break that down, try to understand what's going on there and how to think about subverting that and transforming that dialogue. The roots of this, I think, is really important to recognize what people feel when we do polling around this issue. And this was done before Dobbs. This is a 2018 poll, but it's the best graphic, so I keep using it because the graphic they have from the more recent study is really bad. But what you can see here is it's only white evangelical Protestants who are overwhelmingly against having legal abortion in the country. So when you get to white mainline Protestants, black Protestants, Catholics, all of those religious groups support legal access to abortion, and all of those numbers for support have gone up since Dobbs, some of them fairly significantly. Additionally, this is very much a religious freedom question because it's that minority group of evangelical Protestants as well as Catholic clergy who are promoting a very particular sectarian theological position around abortion that isn't shared within Christianity and across Christianity, and it's certainly not shared by Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and other religious minorities in the country. We can see, and again, particularly the Muslim number went way up after Dobbs. All of these numbers went up after Dobbs. And one of the most interesting things that we saw as those shifts happened was that it was minority religious groups and minorities within Christianity, so Hispanic Catholics in particular, their support for legal access shot up. So clearly a reflection of their experience of what happens when the state gets involved with trying to regulate people's behavior. We also know that most women who are having abortions have some religious affiliation. And so this is clearly something that, this is again part of why we started the Abortion and Religion Project, was to get the narratives and the stories to help begin to transform that conversation in our country. So, right, the pressing question then is Christianity against abortion? You may or may not know that the Bible actually doesn't say anything at all about abortion, despite the fact that the Bible is regularly used in the abortion debate. The text itself doesn't say anything about abortion. And when we look at abortion in Christian history, we can see many things. One of the things we see is that Christian theologians throughout history were often very concerned about the question of when does the soul enter into what I call the prenate? And that question is something that theologians will speculate on, although there is no consensus around that question theologically. For many theologians, it's mentioned in passing. It's something that they might reference, but it's not a major point of contention for any theologian until, the late 19th, early 20th century, when the Catholic Church begins to talk about it more prominently. It's also often included just in a list of general denouncement of what is noted as sexual immorality. So it could be in a list of, you shouldn't have sex, you shouldn't fornicate, you shouldn't have sex while someone's menstruating, you shouldn't have, same-sex relations, you shouldn't, like all these things. And they just include abortion in that list of things that are generally denounced. And the other thing that, as we think about Christian history, that it's important to remember is that pregnancy wasn't even defined until quickening, until the 19th century. So that's the point at which a woman feels movement, which is often well into the 4th or 5th month. Prior to that, there is no pregnancy because the things she's experiencing could be the cause of any number of conditions related to health, diet, other sorts of things. And so it wasn't until quickening that people recognized that there was a pregnancy. So when we talk about ending pregnancy and the idea of abortion, it's not consistent with the way people talk about abortion in the 21st century. And the primary focus for much of Christian history in conversations about sexuality have to do with whether or not the sexual act has the possibility of allowing for procreation. This is why the Catholics continue to disapprove of contraception, that there is this belief that every sexual act must be open to the possibility of children. And so the sexual sin is interfering with that, not the abortion. So again, if we're asking the question, does Christianity support abortion? Historically, we know that prior to Roe, there were a lot of Christians who were part of campaigns to help promote legal access, the decriminalization of abortion, which eventually happened with Roe. The clergy consultation service was rabbis and Christian clergy across the country who, for about 5 years prior to Roe, started in '68, had lists of safe clinics where women could go and have safe abortions at a time when abortion was very, very dangerous. And they would actually visit each clinic, meet the providers to make sure that it was safe. If they ever got a report back that their women were treated poorly or that anything was unclean or unsafe, they took those clinics off the list. So clergy were very active in not only advocating for the decriminalization of abortion, but helping women access abortion care. There's actually been some talk in the last couple of years about rebooting the CCS, the Clergy Consultation Service, as women are having difficulty accessing abortion care in so many places. We also know that all the mainline denominations have on the books statements that call for the continued legal access to abortion. So why does the public think that Christianity is against abortion? One of the reasons is because evangelicals and Catholics give that message all the time. It's very prominent. It's in public spaces. It's on billboards and bumper stickers. And politicians are very outspoken about not apologizing for their stance as well. While mainline and progressive Christians don't want to talk about it. There's just been, we did talk about it prior to Roe and then even in those early days after Roe. But there was a moment in the 80s where people just didn't want to talk about it anymore. It was legal, let's just not talk about it. And so often, I've been working on this now in a predominant way for the last 10 years, and so many places I go, people will say, I grew up Southern Baptist and they talked about it all the time, or I went to this evangelical or Catholic church and you know, every Sunday they were praying for the unborn or talking about this issue, and I've never heard about it in a mainline church that I've gone to. So I hope that this is going to begin to shift more in the wake of Dobbs. So thank you for having this forum. I think that's a really important step. And I hope that you will also recognize that it's important to do more than just have the forum, but to figure out how your church and other churches and Jewish communities across Charlotte can be part of a vocal dialogue around why these issues are important to you as people of faith. Another reason that this perception that Christianity is against abortion is that abortion has been politicized. And we see, like in all of these spaces in 75, the difference between Republicans and Democrats on any of these questions about when abortion should be legal is within one to 4 points. So it was not a partisan issue at all, and it was turned into a partisan issue. So it became a wedge issue. There are several scholars who have documented the way in which this issue was actually taken up by the moral majority and Republican operatives to shift votes toward the Republican Party. So again, the issue itself was politicized in a way that was intended to mobilize conservative Christian communities. After the first Obama midterm, there was a backlash, and there were a number of shifts in state legislatures, and that is when we really saw how abortion was weaponized. And here you can see this is that 2010 election, and there's a spike. So this was all work that happened in state houses across the country. Once Republicans got control of those state houses, they began passing just sheafs of legislation. It started with trap laws, targeted restrictions for abortion providers that were things like you have to be able to pass 2 gurneys in the hallways of a clinic before you can perform abortions. Well, nobody in an abortion clinic is on a gurney, so you don't even need it wide enough for 1, much less 2. And a number of other kinds of provisions that were meant to shut clinics down, and they did. And so I think it's really important as people of faith to say over and over again, abortion is not a political issue. Abortion is a justice issue. And we know that because we look at who is having abortions. You can see here that even in the 80s, only 50% of people having abortions were at poverty line or twice the poverty line, which is people who are in or near poverty, and that by the mid-2010s had gone up to 75%. And so what we have seen over the last few decades is as it becomes increasingly expensive to have children, people who are poor are struggling with raising their families, with taking care of the children they already have, and pregnancies, additional pregnancies, unexpected pregnancies become a burden. So if people are concerned about that, we need to be addressing health care expenses, housing expenses, food expenses, the problems related to poverty that are shaping people's decision making when they're trying to decide, can I continue this pregnancy or not? Sorry. I lost my, here we go. Who else has abortions? We know that they're concentrated among women in their 20s. That's the peak reproductive years in terms of fertility. And it's also when people are least economically secure. And so we see much higher rates, over 50, almost 60% of women in their 20s. So poor women, young women. And the majority of people having abortions are white, 36%, but we also see that it's disproportionately impacting women of color, Black women, Latina, because they are overrepresented in poverty statistics as well. And so there is a disproportionate number of poor women, young women, and women of color who are accessing abortion care. We also know that 60% of the people having abortions are already mothers. They have children that they are struggling to care for, many of them. And so it's important to recognize, again, as we think about those stereotypes about who has abortions and why they're having abortions, those ideas are fictions that have been created to demonize people. And many times it is mothers who are making decisions about the best they can do to care for the children that they already have. So it's important to know the facts. You can't see that there. 45% of pregnancies in the US are unplanned. When I first started doing, I don't know if that surprises you, I found that shocking, that 45% are unexpected. And that's a lot. Among that number, 60% will become wanted pregnancies. So it's not always a bad thing to have an unexpected pregnancy. Some people are okay. If I get pregnant, it'll be fine. But there are a lot of people who aren't. And so even though 60% of those become planned or wanted pregnancies, 40% of those will be terminated. And so if you see data that says the abortion rate has gone down or the number of abortions have gone down, it's because the number of unexpected pregnancies have gone down. The number of total pregnancies in the country have gone down, not because, there's an argument, it will change after Dobbs, but before Dobbs, all of those regulations that were being put in place weren't really changing that 40% rate. It was still 40% of unexpected pregnancies were terminated. And so we saw before Dobbs that there were many women who were still pursuing abortion care, even if it meant they had to drive farther. We don't know entirely what the impact of Dobbs will be because we're the northernmost southern state where you can access abortion. And we've now restricted it to 12 weeks. And so you have all of these people in Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi and Florida who are driving or flying somewhere else. So inevitably, not all of those people will be able to find somewhere to go or have access. Medication abortion is also helping people access. They can get pills through the mail, but you have to know about that to be able to access that as well. So we just talked about that. 20% of all pregnancies end in abortion. And I said this in my sermon, 25% of all women in the US will have an abortion by age 45. It's one of the most common medical procedures in the country. So when we think about how common it is, how normal it is, we need to be able to talk about it because it's happening in so many people's lives. I think it's also really important to recognize that the average US woman spends 2.7 years pregnant, postpartum, or trying to get pregnant. Does that surprise anyone? 2.7 years. I would have thought it was much more than that. That's really not very long, especially when you consider that women are fertile for about 30 plus years, which means we spend 31 years trying to avoid pregnancy. So, I mean, that is a really long time. And I didn't put my slide in here about birth control failures, but when doctors tell the rate of contraceptive success in a clinic when they're prescribing contraception, it's for the first year of use. And what the graphs show is over a 10-year period, every one of those goes up. So if you're using a condom and it's a 14%, 15% rate, After 10 years, it's like 75%. So the rate of contraceptive failure is very high over a 30-year period for people who are sexually active. 99% of US women use contraception in their lifetime. So why has the Christian right been able to define this debate? My short answer is misogyny and patriarchy. If we look at the history of interpretation, hermeneutics around Scripture, what we see is really the story of Eve from the two creation stories, but the one that is often lifted up is that Eve is taken out of Adam, so therefore Eve is derivative and secondary. And not only that, she tempts Adam in the garden, which results in humanity's being cast out and the fall of humanity, right? So everything goes back to Eve. And why this is important is because even though this is only one interpretation of the narratives in Genesis, those patriarchal and misogynist interpretations have been the predominant ones throughout history. So we see Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century. Every woman should be filled with shame by the thought that she is a woman. The consciousness of their own nature must evoke feelings of shame. Yeah, they get worse. Augustine in the 4th and 5th century says, I don't see what sort of help woman was created to provide man with if one excludes procreation. If woman is not given to man for help in bearing children, what help could she be? Martin Luther in the 16th century, the word and works of God is quite clear that women were made to be either wives or prostitutes. Wesley in the 18th century, wife, be content to be insignificant. What loss would it be to God or man had you never been born? So these are just pervasive throughout Christian theology. The attitude toward women is completely misogynist and really damning. It leads to this sort of understanding that Christ is the head of the household. Then you have the husband who's meant to protect and provide for the family, and the wife who manages the children. This didn't stop with the Reformation. I don't know if you all know Russell Moore. He was in the Southern Baptist Convention, the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. A couple of years ago, there was a movement in the Southern Baptist Convention to have a form of feminism that is meant to say that women and men have different roles, but the roles are both equally beloved by God. And this idea of complementarianism is what it's called, that men and women complement each other. But Russell Moore said, oh no, we're not having complementarianism. Patriarchy is good for women, good for children, good for families. The question for us is not whether we will have patriarchy, but what kind. And he was saying we will not have any form of gender complementarianism. So not only can you not have equality, you can't even have an idea that men and women are fully loved equally by God. So this leaves not a lot of room for real women. You can either be prostitutes, whores and temptresses, or virgins and mothers. And this doesn't leave a lot of landscape for real people, for real women, to navigate within the Christian tradition and within Western civilization that is shaped by these very ideas about gender and roles. We can't see that very well. There's our Handmaid's Tale behind us. Handmaid's Tale, all of this leads to a culture that holds that all pregnancies are gifts from God. Prenates are fully human at the moment of conception, and women are morally obligated to gestate when they are pregnant. So these are just ideas that come out of that cultural understanding of gender roles and divine framing of those gender roles. And this creates what I call a justification framework. If you believe these things, then you require women to justify their desire to end a pregnancy. Because you can do it, but you have to have a really good reason, and other people have to agree with you, have to accept that your reason is justifiable. And the way that we see this showing up is even in these polling questions, right? So do you think abortion should be legal under any circumstances, under certain circumstances, or all circumstances? And so the blue line is really the majority of the country. This is after Dobbs. We do see a spike in legal under any circumstances and a decline in illegal under certain circumstances, or all circumstances. But really the majority of the country for decades has held this idea that abortion should be legal only under certain circumstances. That's the justification. And so what are those reasons? I call them the prim reasons. There are not a lot of them, and they're pretty clear. It's prenatal health, rape, incest, and mother's life. These are the reasons. When some pollster asks people, do you think abortion should be legal under certain circumstances? These are the circumstances that people usually have in mind. And there is long-standing support for abortion in these circumstances. These are, people have agreed that these are justifiable reasons, but even within that narrative, abortion is seen as the lesser of two evils, right? All of these things are bad, all of these things are tragic, and an abortion is only okay because it's the lesser of two evils. But what that does is divide abortions in the country between the tragic and the damned. And what we know is that those prim abortions only make up about a quarter of abortions in the country. So almost 3/4 of people having abortions are really part of this group that is marked as damned. Their abortion decisions are not recognized as justifiable, and these are the people who are being specifically targeted by many of the laws. So another problem with this justification framework is that it's focused on this abstract moral question, is abortion right or wrong? And it reduces it to a very simplistic question that has one answer. And as I expect if you're here, most of you know abortion is much more complicated and nuanced and complex. And it can't be really answered in this reductive way, is abortion right or wrong? And in fact, that's not even the question that women are asking. When women are faced with an unexpected pregnancy or a problem pregnancy or problem in their pregnancy, their moral question is, what am I going to do? That's not an abstract question. That's a very real question they have to answer, and it has a timeline. And because so many faith communities have abdicated our participation in these conversations, women asking these questions don't feel like they can go to their faith leaders or their faith communities to talk through, what am I going to do here? So many women are left alone to make this decision. So many of the people that we interviewed hadn't talked to anybody. Many of them are in unhealthy relationships, which is one of the reasons they want to end this pregnancy. There's not a partner that they're talking to help them through this. Now, many of them do have partners, but my point is the cultural conversation in the country is doing a disservice to the work of caring for people in our communities, among other things. So why does it matter what Christians believe? It matters for a lot of reasons, but one of the clearest is in the current political landscape, we have a division between the idea that there is a secular pro-choice community and a religious anti-choice community. And if you have a different kind of religious message, it doesn't fit into that frame. And we need to develop those voices and those positions and arguments and theologies to disrupt this frame, because this binary frame doesn't allow for the complexity of the issue or of people's lives. Christian voices matter because Christian forces are the linchpin of this debate. It is Christian legislators who are, and jurists, who are pushing this on. I mean, look at the polling data from the very beginning of this presentation. People don't want this, and those legislators are pushing this onto all of us in states across the country. Stigma about abortion harms women and families, and that stigma is rooted in religion. It's rooted in religious ideas about the morality of abortion. And it also matters because we need new ways of thinking and talking about pregnancy, abortion, mothering, parenting, ways that open up the conversation and help us recognize the ways in which abortion can actually be a positive choice that people make in their lives and a moral choice. So we need to change the conversation in the country. And what I argue in the book and what I am trying to help people understand and move into is leaving justification behind and moving into this frame of reproductive justice. But it's also important that you really understand what reproductive justice is, where it came from, and what it means if you want to step into that space. Reproductive justice as a movement was created in 1994 by a group of 12 black women who were at a Clinton healthcare conference. So it was several hundred people, mostly white women. It was around choice. I think the conference even had choice in the title. And it was all about what is the role of reproductive choice in this, this healthcare reform that's happening. And these 12 women, the only black women at this conference, found each other and they said, this choice language doesn't work for us. It doesn't work for our communities. Many of the women in our communities don't have a choice. Like, choice implies I could choose to keep this pregnancy, or I can choose to end this pregnancy. And many women just didn't have the resources to raise a child or to continue the pregnancy, and they didn't feel like it was actually a choice they could make to continue a pregnancy. It's a false choice. We call that a false choice. So choice language doesn't work. In addition to that, the children in our neighborhoods are under threat. And the ability to take care of children is part of reproductive justice. Reproductive justice can't just be about getting babies born. It also has to be about caring for families and raising the children that we have. And so for a lot of reasons, these women came together and said, this choice framework is really a reflection of white women's concerns, and we need something bigger and broader that allows for a more complex conversation that brings the realities of our communities into the public conversation. And so they came up at first with 3 tenets, and then they added a 4th. So the first tenet is the right to not have a child. So abortion is the first tenet. They wanted to affirm that we needed to have it as a legal option. But they also said, we also have the right to have a child, because of the ways in which particularly black women have been either forced to bear children or prevented from bearing children through forced sterilization. Both of these tenets were really important for black women in the historical reality of their communities. But they also said, we also have a right to parent in safe and healthy environments. And we need to have communities where our children are safe. We need to work on both of those issues of safety and help. And then later they added the right to bodily autonomy as a 4th tenet. So over the last 30 years, there have been quite a number of reproductive justice grassroots organizations led by women of color, so expanded beyond black women, to other women of color groups, and they've been doing on-the-ground grassroots work on these issues for 30 years. And so as we move into learning from the work they're doing, we always need to remember that at root, this framework has an anti-white supremacist frame to it, and that we have to always think about the ways in which white supremacy is shaping the conversations that we're having about reproduction, fertility, parenting, families. And so it can't just be that we replace abortion with reproductive justice. That if you're someone in the secular movement who has been an abortion activist, that's great. If that's the work you want to do, stay in that space. If you want to expand the conversation, if you want to do the work differently and reject the justification frame, moving into this space requires, particularly since most of us are white in this room, that we do that in ways that honor the legacy and the work that these women created. So we need to stop letting the religious right define the debate. And one of the things that I fear with, in the wake of Dobbs is that a whole lot of attention came up when the Alabama decision put IVF on the table. When we have women, these are real women, this is Brittany Watts, who her water broke at 16 or 17 weeks in Ohio, and she went to the hospital and they kept ignoring her. She left 3 times over the course of 3 days against medical advice until she got home, miscarried in the toilet, went back to the hospital, the nurse rubbing her back saying, "You're gonna be okay, we're gonna take care of you," left the room, called 911, turned her in, and she was arrested for miscarrying. So again, each one of these women has a similar story. My concern is that there has been so much attention. How many people heard about the IVF in Alabama? How many people knew about Brittany Watts? So there are women of color who are being arrested and harmed by these laws, and that's not what is getting the attention. The attention is going to the primarily wealthy families who are wanting to continue to access their IVF. Again, I'm all for IVF, don't get me wrong, but I want to make sure that we are also recognizing that what is happening in the country is really harming people in very, very dangerous ways. This woman, I can't remember her name, she is in Tennessee. She was 3 years sober. She had a 3-month-old. She struggles with her sobriety, as does her husband. Got pregnant again. The prenate implanted in scar tissue from the previous C-section, and she wasn't allowed to terminate, so she had the baby. And there's a big ProPublica, if you're interested, you can find it, about a month ago, did a whole story on her life a year after, which has just fallen apart. She ended up having that baby at like 20-something weeks, and it was in, the neonatal intensive care for months, on top of the 3-month-old she has, the struggling with work and sobriety. So, these stories are just happening across the country. So this is part of the backstory for the Abortion and Religion Project that I'm now currently directing. I have a Jewish colleague, a Muslim colleague, a Catholic colleague, a Black Protestant colleague, and I'm white Protestant. We're interviewing people from our religious traditions who are having abortions. So I've done over 85 interviews so far of Protestant women. Monique, who's doing the Black Protestant women, has done about 50. So we now have a data set of 135 women, Protestant women in the Midwest and the South that we are beginning to write up for journal articles and hopefully also more public facing articles as well, to try to get their stories out into the public conversation, because women don't feel like they can tell their stories. If you have a prim abortion that's acceptable within the current context, more of those women feel safe telling their stories, but many of the other women don't feel like they can talk publicly about their experience. So here's my team. And so all of this is moving into the work that I'm doing to try to help offer new theological frames, new ways of talking about this issue as Christians, I think it's really important to talk about motherhood as moral choice, and to recognize the moral agency of women as part of being created in the image of God, Imago Dei. Women have the capacity for moral agency just like all humans do. And part of that moral agency is making decisions about our fertility and about our families. I think it's also really important to recognize that parenting is sacred. It's one of the reasons I shared so many of the stories in the sermon today is women are making these decisions because they don't want to bear children they can't take care of. That's a responsible decision that recognizes that parenting is a sacred task and that families are really important and that children deserve to be taken care of. Abortion is an act of love. There was one woman who again, I had so many, because I did so many interviews from North Carolina, who had been raised Baptist. And this woman, talked about how she had been, I think it was the woman who said, I can't remember which one it was. It was one of the ones I quoted today. But she talked about how she'd been taught that abortion was a sin, but that she ended the pregnancy as an act of love. And that for her, that meant that she was right with God, that God understood why she was doing this, and that she was doing this as an act of love for a child she couldn't care for. Abortion as a blessing. For many people, there are women we have interviewed who, one woman had POTS syndrome. I don't know if you're familiar with POTS, but it's incapacitating. And her doctor had told her that she would likely die if she got pregnant again. And despite the fact that she and her husband used birth control, she got pregnant again. So there are ways in which these decisions for many women are blessings in their lives. And certainly, it's an enormous religious freedom issue, which we can talk about more as well. So, I don't know how many of you remember Wendy Davis and her filibuster back in 2014. This was when some of those first TRAP laws were coming through Texas, and they were trying to shut down the clinics, and did shut down the clinics. She had her filibuster. She managed to end that session of the Texas legislature, and it didn't get the bill through. The next morning, the governor called a special session, and they pushed it right through. And after that, a bunch of clergy across the state of Texas, Jewish and Christian, came together and said, oh, this isn't going to stop here. This is just the beginning. They saw the writing on the wall, and they knew that this was only going to get worse, and they said, what have we learned from the work that we did as religious communities on LGBT issues that we can use to help inform a very similar thing that needs to happen? They recognized that what we needed was culture change, and that in communities where religion, and specifically Christianity and Christian scripture, is being used to promote a particular agenda, what can we learn from what we did around LGBT issues to help us think about this issue? And so they partnered with Just Texas, created Faith Voices for Reproductive Justice, and created what they called reproductive freedom congregations. This congregation trusts and respects women, creating a movement to eradicate stigma around reproductive health care in Texas, one congregation at a time. I don't know how many people, or how many congregations, I think it may be around 20 or so now, but there are more than 100 that have been talking about this issue as a result of the work that that Just Texas is doing. And that's 120 more congregations than we're talking about it 15 years ago. And so this is how culture change happens, is getting people talking about it and getting communities hearing the voices of faith people and faith leaders saying, there are other ways that we can think about and talk about this issue from a Christian perspective, and there are other commitments that we can have. So I heard about Just Texas and reproductive freedom congregations right after my book came out in 2018, and I would go around the country and tell people about this just great thing they're doing in Texas. So Just Texas started getting these calls from churches in Florida and Ohio saying, hey, how can we be a part of your network? And they were a Texas organization. They couldn't do that. But we formed a national team that developed the Sacred Congregation movement. Sacred stands for Spiritual Alliance of Communities for Reproductive Dignity. We had our first in-person training in the Triangle last April. We will have our second in-person training in Charlotte on Friday. And so I hope that many of you will come or get people that you know to come. We had said if we got, we were doing virtual trainings of trainers because we wrote a 7-week curriculum for congregations to study. So we were having trainings of trainers so people could go and do this study with their congregation members. And we said if we get 20 people, we'll do an in-person. And so we told that to the folks in the Triangle, and we had 80 from 12 congregations. So I hope we will get 80 from at least 12 congregations across Charlotte. This group has now formed the Triangle Interfaith Reproductive Justice Coalition. They're sponsoring films and talks. They're doing all sorts of work in the Triangle around these issues. I hope Charlotte will be the next city that steps forward and begins to do this work. I know that clinic protesters in Charlotte is a very big problem, one of the worst in the country. And this is a community that could really benefit from faith communities and faith leaders standing up and being much more public about this in the public sphere. So this is our training next Friday from 10 to 4. And that's my presentation, but I'd love to talk with you all about, concerns, questions, anything that you have.
Dr. Peters, thank you so much. Before folks come up and speak, I just want to remind our congregation of a piece of history here in Women's History Month, that one of our beloved members who is now passed on, Sarah Bryant, started Planned Parenthood in Charlotte with a red phone in her house.
Wow.
And so this church has been surrounding and supporting the work of reproductive justice since Sarah Bryant, who was a pioneer on that in here. So I just wanted to raise up Sarah Bryant's name for everyone. I hope folks will have questions. Come to the mic, please. Tara, yes, Reverend Tara Gibbs, who is our associate minister of spiritual growth and youth, is a clinic escort. In fact, she has done that enough and gotten into enough altercations with protesters that the most notorious in the country, Flip Benham, has come to church to intimidate Tara when she preaches. So that's just part of the history here. Yeah, that's how he rolls. I hope folks will come for questions.
Hey, thank you so much for presenting reproductive justice, and I was wondering if you can further explore the IVF in that I just dawned on me of I come from an evangelical fundamentalist background, and there were several pastors and ministers in that who actually did use IVF, and I don't think they were really honest with their congregations, or maybe they just didn't even know its link with with reproductive justice and the abortion issue.
Yeah, so I mean, the issue is really this question of when does life begin, which in many ways is a philosophical, theological question. And there is a version of that question, or an answer to that question, that is being promoted very vigorously, even more vigorously since Dobbs, that life begins at conception, and that means that there should be not only no abortions, but no embryos that are destroyed when you have IVF, and many forms of birth control, contraception, would be outlawed. So that's a very extreme position that doesn't match with science or medicine or many people's theology, right? So a pregnancy doesn't happen at conception. A pregnancy happens at implantation. So abortion, which is The ending of a pregnancy doesn't happen until you have a pregnancy. So any form of contraception that prevents implantation isn't an abortion, right? It's contraception. And so they're taking a theological belief about what happens at fertilization and using that as a way to then legislate around contraception and IVF and other issues as well.
Oh, I guess more of my question was, I know people who are like hard line, anti-abortion, anti that, but also have gotten IVF for themselves, where really, like you're saying, if the conception is made, like IVF actually does abort people, many embryos, human embryos that have had conception. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no. So there are two ways.
That's why I wanted to.
There's two ways to say that, and I don't know any of these people. So one way people navigate that is exceptionalism, to say, well, it's okay for me. And people do that all the time, right? This is okay for me because I really want a baby. But the other way is to go through the process and not destroy any eggs, right? Any fertilized eggs, so that you could say, we will only harvest this many, even though we know that the likelihood of success will go down. We will implant all of the ones that are harvested. We won't freeze any of the eggs, or if we freeze eggs, they will then be used, right? So that would be another way to get around that. And again, even though that is against best medical practice as well. So you implant 3 or 4 eggs, what if you have then 4 that take? That isn't a healthy pregnancy for those 4 embryos. Even if if you manage to make it to live birth, the likelihood of the health of those, babies would be potentially significantly compromised.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions?
I'm not really sure how to put this forth, but I'm thinking about, okay, how do I begin the conversation with someone that I know feels differently? That's the thing. How do I bridge that? And secondly, I think for a lot of us, we don't want to begin it because guess what? We don't want to be called baby killers.
Right.
And when that rhetoric starts coming out, we back off.
Yeah.
Because this little part of us goes, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
maybe I am.
Yeah. Right.
So I think that's why a lot of Christians that believe in women's choices just stay away from the other ones.
I hear you, and I think that certainly there's a lot of truth to that. I also think that the fact that mainline and progressive Christians abdicated this topic has left us bereft of alternative theological frames for how to talk about this, which is why I'm trying to help people have new language and new ways of thinking about it, because it's a theological question, it's a philosophical question, and in the absence of other views, all we have is the conservative, life begins at conception. The Jewish take on it is life begins with breath, the first breath a baby takes. That's when life begins, right? That goes back to Genesis. God breathed life into Adam, and Adam was a living being, right? So again, that is very biblical. More biblical than life begins at conception, which isn't biblical at all. So I think that you asked several questions in there, right? So one was, how do we talk to other people? And I think in terms of that question, that one of the things that isn't happening is people aren't talking about this. And so if you have someone you would like to talk about it with, if you ask in a genuine frame of curiosity and interest and dialogue and say, will you tell me what you believe and why, and will you listen to me when I tell you what I believe and why, that you can potentially open up a conversation. there may be people who won't listen to you. So those aren't the dialogue partners you're looking for. And so I think that there are extremes on each end of this. I think it's true on the sort of extreme pro-choice side too. Like there are people who say it's just like cutting my hair or cutting my nails. Like it's not human, there's nothing about it, it's no big deal. I don't think that as a Christian ethicist. I think every decision we make about our fertility and about our family and about who we have sex with and when and why, I think all of those are moral decisions. And I think that people can make good moral decisions around those questions. And I think that, the 50 people in this room may have different theological understandings of when life begins, and that's okay. But the state shouldn't have one of those positions that it then imposes on other people and restricts behavior. So even if you can't get to a point where you talk to someone about what you believe that's different from what they believe, the idea of the state shouldn't be getting into and codifying a particular religious belief, especially because it's a minority religious belief. It isn't even the consensus belief within Christianity. So, there are multiple ways I think you can have those kinds of conversations. Another thing I would say is I encourage you as a congregation to do the sacred 7-week study curriculum, because it walks you through how do you have these conversations with each other, how do you think about how you would articulate your position to someone else, and it helps prepare you for doing that work in the world. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm curious about your conversations that you're seeing and having with your students at Elon, given they're the primary people affected by these laws. And, I have a daughter now in this bracket, and it scares me. That I'd like to see them become more active in the discussions about these things that are affecting them. And my own daughter just kind of shuts down when I talk to her about it, because she was adopted, and her birth mother made a choice to choose life for her. So she's very opinionated about, I will never, ever have an abortion, but I just don't think she thinks through about how hard this was for her own birth mother to actually go through with all this, having an actual child and having to choose to turn this child over to another family.
Yeah, again, there's a lot in what you just said that's really important on multiple levels. So in terms of my students, one of the interesting things that I hear from them are how much young people's response to this is connected to how directly threatened they are. So my Texas students are up in arms and are terrified. My New Jersey students, not so much. I can just go home, right? And so there's a very definite sense of crisis associated with where people live, which I think is happening across the country too. I think that in states where it's legal, people aren't as concerned as I wish they were about what's happening in other states. So that's sort of what I'm hearing from students. I think two things in relation to your conversations with your daughter. One is adoption rates, children being placed for adoption plummeted after Roe. Because prior to Roe, many people didn't have a choice. And so they were forced by family or others to continue pregnancies. And often through the rhetoric of mostly the evangelical movement at the time. And this happened, this is actually, I was just reading a piece this morning. There's another version of this that is beginning to happen in, I think it was Alabama, homes for unwed mothers that we used to have before Roe. You would send people there, women there, they would have babies. The rhetoric we have documented from many evangelical homes was that you could, it's sort of like secondary virginity. They didn't use that language, but if you have this baby, give it to a worthwhile, faithful Christian family, you will then cleanse yourself to a point where you can then be ready to have a legitimate child in your own marriage, you know, at the point when God blesses that, right? It's all this language that is intended to not only guilt women into feeling shame around their sexual activity, but also, you know, shape them in ways that encourage them to place their children for adoption through this. You know, and there's a lot of trauma that happens when people are given that kind of theology. And so what we found, so Alabama is now doing that again. There are these homes that are starting to sprout up with very similar language. Churches adopt a room and they pay for all the stuff for that mother, and there's just really, really explicit theology that's going on with that as well. But what we found after Roe was that women after Roe were choosing between parenting and ending the pregnancy, not between ending the pregnancy and adoption. That women, and this is true in the stories I'm collecting now, people will say, it's not a baby right now. Like, they're so early. And many of them will even say, if it were later, I don't think I could do this, but it's so early, I don't think it's a baby. And so I'm okay ending this pregnancy. If I were to continue this pregnancy and give birth, then it would be my baby, and I couldn't give my baby away. So there is something that happens for many women in the process of a pregnancy where something that isn't yet a baby becomes their baby, and then they're not able to place that child for adoption. There is a very small group of people who do, and, you know, that is, you know, I hear that that's sort of where your daughter is sitting around in that space about what does that mean for me? But I think there's also this level of recognition that, and you know, your daughter may be too young for this, it may not be the space, but I met a woman an activist in Tennessee a couple of months ago who, her mother was raped and she was the result of that pregnancy, and her mother hates her. Her mother will have nothing to do with her. I mean, her mother kept her and raised her and hates her. And she was a very self-assured, confident woman, but she said, it would have been so much better for my mother if she'd had an abortion, right? It's not about me, I'm here, she didn't, but it would have been better for her, and people should have that choice. So that once babies are in the world, they are people. But before that, many of us don't think they're people yet, right? And so that's a really hard intellectual place to think through, especially if you're part of a story that reflects that experience. But I think that this idea that if we had never been, we wouldn't know, there would be no impact. But that's a hard space. Yes.
I'm a visitor, not a member of the congregation, but I appreciate the chance to speak about this. And I was thinking about Sydney's question about how do we talk to people about this. So I'm the former Planned Parenthood board chair and on the board for 10 years. And we received training as board members about how to talk about abortion. I don't know what the current I'm not speaking for Planned Parenthood, and I don't know what their current research and messaging says, but what we were taught at the time, based on their research, is that instead of talking in big generalities about women, that the way to have the conversation was to use woman and to say, you know, no women could know what would happen. If you say, no one can know what a woman in her particular circumstances is actually dealing with and what's going into her decision about whether to continue a pregnancy or have an abortion. And they had a whole campaign called In Her Shoes, really trying to make it more
Personalize
personal,
it.
because what
Yeah.
they found was when you talked about the collective of women, people didn't connect with it. But when you talked about not a specific, but
Right.
a woman, we can't know what that person is dealing with. And your daughter, she thinks in really sort of a hypothetical context that I would never.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
yesterday was the 1-year anniversary for when my daughter had to make the horrible choice to have an abortion at 21 weeks after fighting for 10 weeks to try to not have to do that because of the extreme complications they were seeing. And it was the worst choice ever for her, except that for her, based on what the doctors were telling her, it wasn't a choice in her mind, because of what it might do to her, what it might mean for the baby if it were born. And again, anybody else could come to that circumstance and have a different decision and outcome, but there's no one who knows. I don't know what it would be like to be in my daughter's shoes and make that decision. And I think that that's really what we have to think about, is just to make it, not to make it a judgment on any generalized basis, but to say, none of us really knows.
Yeah, I think, that's very helpful, thanks. I think that's really true, that there's also a whole group of people who say, I'm pro-choice, but I would never have an abortion. And that's my response in those conversations exactly, which is, you can't know that, because you can't imagine being diagnosed with cancer, or you can't imagine if your husband unexpectedly died, or you can't imagine, we could keep going of all of the things that you can't imagine, because people are making this decision, and many of the people said, I never thought I would be here, because no one has on their bucket list that they want to go have an abortion. I mean, that's something that happens in response to life circumstances. And there's something about our lack of imagination in understanding what other people go through that's a reflection of our capacity for empathy. And I think that, that...
Judgment.
Yeah.
Judgment without any real foundation or knowledge.
Right, which is, again, the justification frame. That's the whole way in which we've been taught to talk about this. And I think that's what we have to overturn. Yeah, all right. Thanks.
Hope some of you will join us Friday for this training. Thank you so much. This training is at Sharon Presbyterian Church at the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation. That's the seminary, which is a Presbyterian seminary. Yes. The training is this Friday from 10 to 4 at Sharon Presbyterian Church on Sharon Road at the seminary, which is there at Sharon, which is Union Presbyterian Seminary at Charlotte. So we hope you'll come out for the training.
Do you send out a newsletter or something?
Yeah, their registration will be in the newsletter that comes out this afternoon. You can register there. Thank you so much. Thank you again.